All right, another episode of the Gray Area Podcast from the Michigan Institute of Athletics in Brighton, Michigan. I'm super excited about this episode. I gathered a little bit of information and a little bit of intel in advance, and I think it's going to be a really great show. So right before we get into it, I want to shout out VetLife. VetLife is a 501c3 nonprofit company. It's a company of veterans for veterans. Every veteran faces difficulties when they transition from active duty back to civilian life, and VetLife is there to ease that transition. If you want to reach out to VetLife, you can do so through Instagram or Facebook, or check out their website at vetlifetoday.org. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Seth Norrholm. Seth, I'm going to start this episode the way that I start all my episodes. I don't want to know about the man that you are today yet. I want to take your story all the way back. You know, where were you born and raised? What were you like as a young man? What was life like for you? What were the things that were influential to you? Like, what really shaped you as a young man, and what were you looking at towards the future?
So I grew up on the East Coast, and my dad was in the Navy, so I spent a lot of time up and down the East Coast because of his experiences.
Where on the East Coast? Because I'm from the East Coast too.
So I was born in New London, Connecticut, because my dad was on submarines, and that Groton, Connecticut area is the birthplace of submarines. And so I spent some time in Connecticut. I was probably a little too young to remember most of it. And then we moved shortly after that to Charleston, South Carolina, where we spent a couple of years. But the bulk of my childhood was really spent outside of Philadelphia in a place called Turnersville, New Jersey, which is about 17 miles or so outside of Philly. And, my dad had retired from the Navy then and was working for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as an inspector. So he had a background in nuclear physics that he used in the Navy and then in his civilian life after that. So that took us to the D.C. area outside of, in Bethesda, outside of D.C. Went to high school in Montgomery County, Maryland, and went to undergraduate at the University of Maryland shortly after that. And it was really during those early years of my dad being in the Navy that really started my affinity for service members, veterans, and families. Just having lived the experience of watching my dad go out, for several weeks at a time. And then, he was in the reserve, so he would do the active duty and then be gone for 1 weekend a month. And I just have this vivid memory in my mind of him coming in his dress whites in the door and just being like, wow, this is, something I'm really passionate about and interested in. And so I'd always had this interest in the military, in grade school and in middle school. And it wasn't until I got to high school where I wanted to see, well, how can I make this part of my life? And so what I really zeroed in on at that time were the service academies. So I lived in Maryland, so I was well aware of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. I was born in New London, Connecticut, like I mentioned, where the U.S. Coast Guard Academy is. And then I found out about the United States Air Force Academy being in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So in my junior year of high school, I was really laser focused on going to one of those. And I'd always been a good student, so it was something where I didn't necessarily think this was going to be an academic challenge, but, you had to get an appointment from a senator to go to these academies. But it wasn't until the summer of my junior year where I really dug into this, where I realized that there are medical requirements as well. And, we're talking about benign medical conditions. I have psoriasis and eczema, right? It's dry skin. But back then, that was a disqualifying feature. So I got what was called med boarded out. So with the Air Force Academy and the Coast Guard Academy specifically, I got in academically. And then when you get to stage 2, that's when they do the physical readiness checks for you. They do the physical, medical history, and all that. And that's when I found out that I was med boarded out for this benign skin condition. And so for me, having built up, watching my dad over the years, and then having designs on going to one of these academies myself, and then to have that, basically as a 16, 17-year-old crushed like that, I had to reassess things. How can I address what I'm interested in, but do it within these limitations that have been placed on me? So I always also had an interest in mental health. So if you want to back up for a second, also an influence of my father. And, we were talking before the show about the influence that our parents have on us, and there's no way to understate that. So when I was 11 or 12 years old, I don't remember exactly, my dad was going to the eye doctor because he was having vision problems. And the way he described these vision problems was he was unable to see certain parts of his visual field. So it wasn't as if, he had blindness or everything was blurry. He was just missing parts of his visual field. So if something came in from the side, he wouldn't be able to see it. So he goes to the eye doctor, and, me and my 11 adolescent brain, I'm thinking, okay, he's going to come back with glasses or something like that. And so my mom sits us down and she says, Dad's having brain surgery on Friday. And so I said, brain surgery? He went to the eye doctor. So that was the first time that I'd really made kind of a connection between, sort of our sensory experience and our brain and that relationship between them. So this idea that a problem with my dad's eyes led to brain surgery was just phenomenal to me. It just, sparked this interest in neuroscience. And so I was, talking to the doctors and finding all I could about, this type of tumor. So the way that the tumor worked was it's called a meningioma, which is a growth that is on the surfaces that cover the brain. They're called meninges. They protect the brain. And so his particular tumor was at what we call the optic chiasm. So if your two eyes are here and you've got your optic nerves here, those optic nerves actually cross under the brain and go back to your visual cortex. So his tumor was right there at the optic chiasm, which was explaining why his visual field was being lost and not complete vision loss, is that he had this tumor that was impinging on his optic nerves and was affecting his sight. So he had 2 surgeries when I was a kid that basically reduced the size of the tumor. So that it didn't restore any of his vision because it's a degenerative kind of thing, but it staved off vision loss. But there was enough of the tumor that they couldn't get to, because that's an area of the brain that also includes the pituitary, the hypothalamus, life-saving and life-preserving areas of the brain. They just couldn't get it all safely. So it continued to grow over, 15, 20 years, to the point where it eventually did take his sight back in 2000, the year I got married. So anyway, that experience with my dad and his brain tumor really got me fascinated in this area of neuroscience. So if we get back to where I was in high school, so now I've got this interest in military service members and what the military experience is, and then my dad being at this point now a disabled veteran. How can I merge these interests? So I went to Maryland as a psych major, and I was really focused on the biological basis of behavior. So really getting into, the nerves that are sending signals to different parts of the brain. So less to do with kind of the touchy-feely counseling and clinical psychology, at least at that point, and more to do with the hardwiring, what's going on in the brain and the nervous system. And so then I knew, being an undergraduate psych major, that, there's going to be years of schooling ahead. So what does that trajectory look like? So then I went to the University of Hartford and the University of Connecticut Health Center, so kind of a joint program in neuroscience, a master's program. And it was there that I really kind of honed more what my interests were. And so got the master's degree in neuroscience, and then decided to go on for a PhD. So I went down to Tallahassee, Florida, went to Florida State University in their neuroscience program. And it was there that I really became interested in the effect that early life experiences have on later brain development and behavior extending on beyond that. So having looked at the brain from kind of a neurological standpoint, these are the different parts of the brain, this is what happens when this part gets damaged or this part gets damaged, to really looking at, okay, we've got this developing organism, whether it's human being or the animal models that we use in the laboratory. What is it about these early life experiences that has long-term consequences? So for my master's thesis, I looked at early life experience for rat pups. So it's kind of like early life adversity model, where you're separating the animal pups from their mother for a short period of time every day. Some people think about it as an animal model of neglect. It depends on how you really view those kinds of experiments. How close to the human experience is it? And then when I was doing my PhD, I was interested in, because at that time, this was the early 2000s, antidepressants were being prescribed to teens and adolescents more frequently. So the question then was, obviously, if you still have a developing brain and these individuals are taking psychoactive drugs, what are the long-term effects? So looking at an animal model of taking antidepressant drugs at a juvenile age and using rodents, and what we found was that the exposure to the antidepressant drugs at a juvenile stage actually arrested brain development. So there's an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory. And so what we were seeing was the hippocampus develops over time. You get these synaptic connections that are formed that really lay down the foundation for our memories, for how we remember, the milk is in the refrigerator, our car is in the garage, these sort of spatial orientations. So what we were seeing is in these animals that were taking the antidepressants or were given the antidepressants, they weren't making as many synaptic contacts. So the question was, well, what are the long-term effects of this? So after that, finished my PhD in that work, and then went on. And while I was at Florida State, I met my wife. So she was a biology graduate student at the time, and then realized while she was there she wanted to go to law school. So that took our now joint career trajectories to Kentucky, where she's from. She did her undergraduate work in biology at the University of Kentucky, then went back in 2001 as a law student, and I went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Kentucky, looking at potential ways to treat methamphetamine addiction. So one of the things that I had learned as a graduate student was we have this the system in our brain that not only is it responsive to early life stress, but it's also responsive to early life exposure to drugs. And there are situations where repeated stress can lead to a vulnerability to take drugs later in life, or early life exposure to drugs can make you more susceptible to the effects of stress later in life. So the kind of this cross-sensitization between drugs and stress. So that was sort of formed during my graduate years, and then as I was adding on more postdoctoral training, trying to hone down on where I really wanted to focus. So while I was at the University of Kentucky in the College of Pharmacy, basically testing all these different compounds to see if they could potentially be used to treat amphetamine. And most of the work was in these biological, what we call wells, where we're using, pipettes, and so it was very far removed from the human condition. So it was during that 2-year time in Kentucky where I realized, I want to get back to sort of the foundation of how I got started in this field to begin with. And so I said to my wife, I don't want to do this wet bench lab-based stuff. I want to be more closer to the human condition. So at that point, made the decision to go to Tampa, Florida, where I went to the University of South Florida and the James Haley VA, which is in Tampa, and really started working with individuals who were focused on PTSD. And so while I was there, we were doing animal models of PTSD, and maybe we'll talk about this later in the discussion, but PTSD is a human disorder, is very heterogeneous. It spans many different aspects of life, how you deal with fear, how you deal with depressed mood, relationship problems, anger, substance use, depression. So the idea that you're trying to model this in humans is really onerous and hard to do. So I realized at that time, and, life happens. So my wife is trying to find a job as an attorney, and I'm trying to find a job where I can continue these academic pursuits. And so that took us to Atlanta, Georgia, where she started as an associate at a law firm in Midtown Atlanta, and I went to Emory University and the Atlanta VA. And we spent 15 years there. And so it was during that 15 years that I really laid down what my research trajectory was and ultimately what my clinical trajectory was, which was on PTSD. So I went to the Atlanta VA in 2004, coincident with my arrival at Emory, focused on PTSD, really looking at the disorder in terms of how it affects our ability to face fears, but also deal with fears. So I call myself a translational neuroscientist. So the word translational in the scientific sense means going from molecules to behavior, going from the wet bench to the clinic. And so that was really where my interest lies and still continues to lie now, even here in Michigan. So what we were looking at Emory was how we learn fear. So if you think about Pavlov's dog, going way back in psychology, and for those that don't know, the idea was Pavlov would give his dogs this meat powder, and the meat powder would make the dog salivate. And what he realized was the dogs were beginning to learn that when they heard the jingle of the keys at the lab door, they would start to salivate. And so Pavlov and his assistants noticed this, and they said, what's going on here? And what they found was what we call associative learning. So it didn't take long for the dogs to pair the meat powder with the sound of the keys, which ultimately became a bell that Pavlov and assistants would ring that would get the dogs to salivate. So as long as you paired what we call an unconditioned stimulus. So if I present you with whatever your favorite food is, you're going to start to salivate. If I present that food to you and I snap my fingers, eventually if I do it enough, when I snap my fingers, you'll start to salivate at the thought of eating your favorite food. So the same thing happens with fears. And that's where I've spent a bunch of my work is looking at associative learning with fears. So the example I like to give a lot in interviews is the Iraq war veteran or the Afghanistan war veteran who's riding in a Humvee. And that's an almost universal experience for those who have been deployed to the Mideast, is riding in a Humvee. And the almost 60 to 70% of the PTSD that I've seen in my career has been in service members that were hit by an IED explosion in a Humvee. So if you think about that from a classical conditioning standpoint, going back to Pavlov and his dogs, if there's an explosion outside of your vehicle, that's going to cause a fear reaction in you no matter what. You don't need to learn anything. That's dangerous to you. It's going to cause an increase in your heart rate. It's going to cause your increase in your breathing rate. It's going to shut down the non-essential systems in your body like digestion, because now you're thinking what we typically think of as fight or flight. So that explosion goes off. It takes no learning for your body to kick into survival mode. Now, if you're riding in the Humvee, the inside of the Humvee, the personnel that you're riding with, the time of day, the sand in the desert, all of those become what we call conditioned stimuli. So all the things that were present when that IED explosion went off can become what we call clinically triggers. So you have your veteran who's riding in the Humvee, they're hit by an IED, maybe some service members are injured, the Humvee is obviously damaged. So then this person goes back and they finish their deployment and they're back stateside and they're sitting on I-75 by Royal Oak, let's say, which is notorious for traffic. And they're standing or sitting in traffic behind cars, looks a lot like a convoy, which these Humvees ride in. And let's say there's, on the construction site, there's a pile of dirt and the wind kicks up and kicks the dirt across the road. Somebody who has PTSD related to an IED explosion may have a fear response in that moment because that association has been made. So our job as PTSD clinicians is to break that association. So to get them to realize what was once dangerous when you were in the Humvee and there were actual munitions going off and you were being fired at is not happening at I-75, you would hope. Now, you can talk about the context that we live in today where maybe it's not as far-fetched to think you're going to come under fire. But the idea clinically is to break that association. So I spent 15 years at Emory University really honing in on how we can best treat PTSD. And is it through the use of medications? Is it through the use of therapy? Is it the combination of the two? So then in 2019, I was given the opportunity to come up here to Wayne State in Detroit to really build up a trauma program, really focused on the neurobiology of trauma, the different aspects of trauma that we can focus on as researchers and clinicians in terms of what are vulnerability factors for trauma, what are mitigating or buffering factors against developing, fear and anxiety-like disorders after trauma. And so I'm currently the director of what's called the Neuroscience Center for Anxiety, Stress, and Trauma, or NeuroCast for short, at Wayne State. And it's an interdisciplinary program, translational in nature by design. So we're doing everything from rodent models all the way to clinical studies to really focus on how we can treat trauma and stressor-related disorders, how we can treat the disorders that they're comorbid with or co-occurring with, like depression and substance use. So I've really spent the last 20 plus years now focused on PTSD and trauma across populations, and that's been a career objective of mine. And it's I was telling a coworker earlier today, I'm at the point of my career now where I'm really trying to figure out what is that next step. Is it psychedelics? Is it, at what point do we overturn the apple cart of what's been done in the past and start looking at some new and innovative ways of treating PTSD?
So that was incredible. I mean, the whole time that you were just speaking, I was engaged in this conversation like I haven't been in a long time. I think it's because anxiety, PTSD, mental health conditions are such a massive factor in society right now. And my mother was a schizophrenic who actually took her own life. So she struggled with a ton of mental health issues. And she was one of the first people that was prescribed like Zoloft and those treatments back in the day, which now we know can like lead to more suicide ideations and things like that without other proper treatment methods. She ended up taking her own life. And so I was extremely fascinated. So I want to ask you a couple questions, and there's so much to go over in what you said already. Let's start with this. With something like PTSD, most people relate it just to like a military stance.
Right.
Like that's where the term really became popular. But post-traumatic stress disorder could be from any significant stress that took place, almost from any point of your life, if it's still having that Pavlov's dog effect, where you have associated behavior from a stress that is no longer existent. It's no longer here, but your brain says, this is a lot like this. And then all of a sudden the parts of the brain start going nuts and it's fight or flight. And you're thinking like, oh my God, I'm in survival. And when people are in survival, they're not in their thinking brain.
Right.
They're not working through the actual stimulus. They're in an event. They're in a story. They're in, oh my God, that I-75, it actually means there's probably an IED up ahead and I need to get out of here. What have you found through this lifetime of research and all of these clinical studies to be the way that you should treat a PTSD patient of any type? Forget military. Someone who's dealing with a substantial stress that clearly has associated behavior still in their life. What is the treatment?
Well, let's take a step back for a second. So to your first point, PTSD obviously has a military and a service member connotation to it. If you look at the history of the disorder over the decades, as long as there's been recorded history of conflict between humans, there have been aspects of what we now call PTSD that have been present.
I mean, it's stress, right? I mean, traumatic stress has been around since the dawn of time.
Had a number of different names, shell shock being one that's thrown around. Oftentimes we talk about, with Patton, Patton recognized the signs of PTSD in his service members, and, whether you believe the media history or the movies, it's believed that Patton's treatment for that was send them back out. And that's obviously controversial. So to your first point, yes, PTSD is oftentimes associated with military trauma, but it is in fact any psychological trauma, civilian or military. But there are caveats and there are limitations that we use in the field to differentiate what is traumatic stress versus what is everyday daily life stress. So one of the things that we think about with PTSD is that trauma what we call Criterion A. So what Criterion A means is, did it instill a sense of fear, helplessness, horror in an individual at the time that they were experiencing the event? And there have been debates recently in the field as to whether or not you needed to have that sense of intense fear at the time of trauma. But
isn't that kind of the definition around traumatic? Because otherwise it would just be stress.
It would. So you want to think about it in terms of how intense it was, how likely the stressor was to cause physical harm to yourself or somebody else, to potentially cause death to yourself or somebody else. So like I said, there's been a debate in the field as to what is a Criterion A trauma. So for example, a few years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020, 2021, there were individuals and there were research lab groups that were just defining the COVID-19 pandemic as a traumatic stressor. And myself and several other people wrote an article specifically saying, hold on a second, it's a stressor. It's certainly a significant stressor that many of us are dealing with, but it's not Criterion A as we would think about it as PTSD researchers and clinicians, because it's within the realm of what's happening in everyday life. People get infections seasonally. People get infections all the time. They were talking about, first responders who are, or ER workers who are seeing these deaths, and not to discount their experience at all. It's certainly distressing, but this is part of what the ER atmosphere is for people who are ER docs and nurses and EMTs and paramedics. That's part of their existence. It's part of their job description. So it's not necessarily Criterion A just because people are dying in front of you.
Well, and to be honest, to blanket one whole thing like that, one way or another, does not seem accurate because fear is subjective.
Right.
What I experienced through the pandemic may not be traumatic at all. But you, based on your brain state, your mental health, it could have been end of the world cataclysm in your mind that has now convinced you that the world, if you open your front door, is severely dangerous. There's a tiger in the bush, fight or flight's on red alert. Fears are subjective.
Right.
So how in the world could any group want to blanket something like that if you're trying to get down to, because like you and I may respond to any fear stimulus differently.
Right.
What might be traumatic to me might not be to you, and vice versa. Like, so if we're trying to make these discernments and we're trying to ascertain, was this traumatic? I don't think you can blanket things like that. Right. How does that make sense in a clinical?
Right. So let me first say this, which is when we're talking about traumatic stress, this is more to your point a second ago. You know, depending on what you read, 75 to 80% of us will experience a Criterion A trauma in our lifetime. Motor vehicle accident, sexual assault, confrontation on the street, robbery, mugging. It's going to happen to most of us at some part in our life. The good news is the majority of us get better with time. Our brains and our nervous system and our psyche recognize that this was a dangerous time in my life, but it is now over. So the more time that passes since that event, for most people, their symptoms go down. So there is something we call clinically acute stress disorder, which most people would meet the criteria for in the seconds right after something happens or the minutes and hours after. And
why do you think it is that some people, though, when we're all just human beings, why is it that some people, just through time and distance from the event, they can re-engineer their brain in a way that it's no longer having that key effect?
Right. So that's the key question of what I've been spending 20 years to study is what is it about the individuals who are not part of the 75 to 80% who don't get better with time? And the short answer to that is it has to do with things like upbringing. It has to do with things like resources that are available to you. It has to do with things like genetics.
But what is the central thing? What does one upbringing maybe provide that the other upbringing does not provide? Like, yes, it could be from your upbringing or not, but what is the central piece of this?
So the central piece, and again, it's multifaceted,
yeah,
so you can't really...
Sure. No, I understand.
Do you have the mental, physical, and practical resources to deal with the stressful event? So what we find is, for example, when I was in Atlanta and now in Detroit, is inner city Atlanta and Detroit, trauma is the norm. And in fact, most people don't have one Criterion A trauma. They have many Criterion A traumas. And so when you really drill down into what is it about individuals that make them either at risk or protected against PTSD and related disorders, it is things like, do they have a sense of family? Do they have a sense of community? Are they active in religious groups? Do they have loving relationships? So social network, and my students get sick of me telling them this, social networks and social support is huge no matter who you are. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, who are you surrounded with? Who are you talking to? In the face of acute trauma, who are you meeting with? Who are you talking with after the fact? Who do you lean on? Because again, it's within the realm of your human experience. If you experience a traumatic event, you're going to respond to it. It's going to make you scared. It's going to make you sad. It's going to give you nightmares. It's going to give you flashbacks. But it should get better with time. So what we're interested in with PTSD is why it doesn't.
I think what you just said, though, that's what I would have proposed. These are the foundations of being a healthy human being, is the quality of relationships, the environment, the way you view yourself in the world. Are you proud of the person that you are? Do you use the truth as a metric in your life? When I'm on I-95 or whatever, I-75, whatever, and dust starts blowing, the truth is a core tenet of my belief systems and allows me to say, although there might be similarity to what I once experienced, this event is in no way correlated to that event. Now, that doesn't mean that pattern recognition should be thrown out, that we shouldn't look to the past and say, well, this has yielded that. The truth is the way you combat mental at least from this perspective, the way I would combat that thing anecdotally is I would look at the event and easily be able to use the truth as a metric and say that this is not the danger.
Right. And so that's a great segue into another cluster of PTSD symptoms. So we've talked about a little bit of the hallmark symptoms, which are flashbacks and re-experiencing. The classic example that I like to give is, I had a Vietnam veteran who I was talking to, and he was playing golf with his buddies, and a helicopter flew over and he dove into the sand trap because in that moment he was back in Vietnam and that was an enemy aircraft above his head. So you say the truth. So the one of the core features of PTSD is negative cognition, negative or altered cognitions and mood. So in other words, the way you think about yourself and the world becomes distorted. So when you say, I want to rely on the truth, this is just a bag of dirt at a construction site, yes, but to the traumatized brain, to the distorted brain, that's not what that is, because you mentioned earlier,
I understand,
the primitive brain, that kicks in first, and then you would hope that your higher brain regions say, no, this is Royal Oak, Michigan. This is not,
So how
Kandahar.
do you strengthen that? Because that makes sense. You might have that initial reaction. You dive in the ground. But then it's like you should almost laugh at yourself and say, God damn, that event really did get to me because I'm out here golfing with my friends and that's a helicopter that's flying over. You would expect the higher brain to take over, but the primitive brain, of course it leads off. It's survival and reproduction. It's your basic drives. How do you fix that in people, and how do you get them to not distort reality? I love the way that you just said that. They live in a distorted reality, even if at moments at a time, maybe not all the time, maybe all the time. How do you work to make that better?
So the most tried and true means of dealing with PTSD right now are what we call cognitive behavioral therapies. So break that down for a second. Cognitive, we're changing the way people think. Behavioral, we're changing the way people act in certain situations. And we know that there's a relationship between thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And so we're trying to correct what are called automatic thoughts. So, automatic thoughts can be anything from something goes bad in your day and you say to yourself, oh, I fucked up again. Oh, sorry, I don't know.
No, it's okay. You're more than welcome to curse.
All right.
If people don't want to hear this dialogue because of some cursing, it is what it is.
Yeah. So you want to address those automatic thoughts first. Why did you immediately go to, I am flawed or something else is flawed? Let's change the way you're thinking about that. But to get back to the Pavlov's dog scenario, one of the things that we know with classical conditioning is you have an associative learning that takes place. So let's just go back to the bell for a second. So what Pavlov was able to do is then take those dogs and just ring the bell, no meat powder. Ring the bell, no meat powder. So it didn't take long for those dogs and for many organisms to realize, well, this cue no longer signals what it used to. And we call that extinction learning. So getting back to the majority of people get better after trauma, it's because of things like extinction learning. They go into their car, they're sitting in traffic, nothing bad happens. They do that 5 days a week for 6 weeks. Extinction learning. Yes, I had one bad experience in a vehicle where an explosion went off, but every time since then,
I've had 999,000 that it was.
No explosions, so extinction learning. So one way we look at PTSD is a failure to extinguish fear or failure to break apart that association. So what we do in the lab or in the clinic is what's called exposure therapy, which is essentially another word for extinction training. So if you come in to me and you say, I was in an IED, I was in a Humvee, we were hit by an IED, what we're able to do now, so there are two forms of exposure therapy. One is imaginal exposure therapy, and that's what you think of traditionally. So I have you come into the office and I say, take me through the event from start to finish. And you'll go through it. I'll watch you go through it. I'll watch to see if you have physiological reactivity. There may be what we call hot spots where you get to a point where just before the explosion happened, that's really hard for you to recall, or maybe you're not recalling it on purpose. We'll address those. So then over a series of weeks, you'll come in and go through the event from start to finish. And what should happen if you're doing well in the therapy and extinction learning is taking place is the way that you were on day one, where you were sweating and your heart was racing and you really just wanted to get out of that session, all the way to the last session where you can go through the entire traumatic history of the event and have very little reactivity. That's what we would call successful exposure treatment. Now, what we know is that kind of treatment is what we call context dependent. So if I had you come into my office and did exposure therapy with you in my office every week for 12 weeks, but you weren't doing that at home, well, we're extinguishing the fear within this context of you and I, but if you're not doing it at home, you're either reconsolidating that fear or you're just not treating it. So what we do is what we call in vivo exposures. So I would say, come in and tell me about the Humvee attack. Then I want you to go home, sit in your driveway, take the car the next week, go down the block, drive by yourself. So we're building up in a graded fashion. So we call that in vivo exposure therapy. So that's the way it's been done traditionally. Now, what I've been doing more recently in my lab, which has really been a pretty cool set of projects, is using virtual reality as a way of presenting exposure therapy. So we did it in Atlanta through the Emory Veterans Program while I was down there.
That's brilliant, by the way.
And what that allows you to do is, okay, you don't want to get to those hot spots, or you don't want to tell me about right before the IED hit. I can create a virtual Humvee, sit you in it, and again, we're not doing what used to be called flooding, where I would just put you in a Humvee and we would send you on the road and then we'd detonate an explosive, because that would be counterproductive, right? to put it lightly. But what we can do is, okay, day one, you come in the Humvee. Where were you sitting? Are you on the passenger side? Okay, we'll put you in the passenger side. What time of day was it? It was dusk, so we'll make the scenario dusk. It was windy. So basically what the therapist has is an entire control panel on this side, and then the patient is over here. And what they tell me, I can incorporate it. So there was small arms fire, so I can do small arms fire.
It makes perfect sense, though, to simplify this, not to rush this along, but to simplify this. You're getting the patient or person to recreate or confront the fear. Like, the way out of these fears is through these fears.
Right.
You almost, it's that voluntarily engaging that which haunts you that helps cure you from the madness. It's like, that's been known since the dawn of time. Like, that's been in research forever. The question is, like, how do we most effectively do that? Virtual reality, you just blew my mind when you said that in person. You can safely recreate someone's hell or someone's torment and allow them to survive the experience and allow them to see that they are stronger than this grasp that it holds on them. That is unbelievable, the application of what that could do for people. As I'm sitting here picturing it, you could put people in their darkest moments again.
Right.
And allow them to heal. Do you know Anton Harb? Are you friends with him?
I do, yeah.
He did it through an ayahuasca trip. He went down to Peru, and he had to relive that haunting moment where that child bled out on his foot.
Right.
And he had to live through that moment again and sobbed, he said, in a way that, like, was not even human. But that's where the healing came from. And it's like, I had never considered until sitting with you here today an application like that from virtual reality, where, because without people like you and many others, like, people won't confront those dark moments, those demons. They know they're there, but they think by not confronting it, it's like the way to be at peace. When in fact, you would agree that confronting it is most likely in stages. Like you said, you could just throw them in the Humvee and blow it up again, which, although traumatic, what about when they've done that 50?
Right. That, people that are deployed multiple times are doing their own form of exposure therapy, whether they know it or not.
If you watch the scariest movie of your life and you have to shut it off the first time you see the demon or bad guy or whatever it is, and then you watch that scene every day and that movie every day, your brain will adapt to the stimulus or the stress or the reaction. And then by the 50th time, you're probably laughing at the movie. Like, oh, look, the Evil Dead person's coming back to get
Right. So there's two things to point out. One is, when you're doing the virtual reality, what you're trying to do is re-engage the memory. So oftentimes, people might come in and if you've done any video gaming in the last 15, 20 years, you know how remarkable the graphics have become. But you don't necessarily need that level of realism to re-engage the fear memory. I mean, our first, and we're going back 20, 25 years now, the first virtual Vietnam that was created, if you remember the Atari video games from the 80s, I mean, it wasn't much more than that, but it was enough for Vietnam veterans to re-engage that memory that they could process it better than they could when they were doing the imaginal forms. So you're trying to re-engage the fear memory. The other thing is when you're doing those VR worlds is you're not trying to re-traumatize. So, the example with Anton, we wouldn't necessarily need to have the bleeding child in order to do exposure therapy. You could have the context in which the child was presented to him. You could have maybe blood or maybe even children that are not harmed in any way, just exposure to children. So you do have to kind of play a fine line between exposure
What's the
therapy.
detriment? What if you blew up the guy in the Humvee because he's sitting in your lab and he's perfectly healthy and he's perfectly safe, although doesn't feel good in the moment, probably feels catastrophic. Not catastrophic. You're going to walk out of that office today, and each time you are confronting fear. What's
what you
what's the
would
downside?
hope. What you don't want to do is reinforce the fear. So if doing that flooding type of experience where you put them in there with all the bells and whistles all the way to the explosion, if you reconsolidate that memory, then you're actually working against what you're trying to do, which is break apart the association. So
if I had that experience and I was in your lab and you were putting me through that experience each day, it could make it stronger?
Right. So there's two potential trajectories. One is if I present this over and over, you're going to desensitize, right?
I'm going to realize I'm safe now. This was a once...
People have used the term habituation, but the idea is it becomes less and less and weakened as you're exposed to it. But there is the potential for some people where it's just going to get reinforced and it's going to become stronger instead of the opposite.
Is that likely? Do you think that's the common thing?
That's a great question, because there's a debate in the field, not necessarily related to this point, but to the idea of what do you do post-trauma. So I'll give you a practical example that drives me crazy. So obviously we're dealing with shootings in America. It's something we see quite frequently, and we're seeing them in places where you wouldn't expect to see shootings in most days: churches, schools, shopping centers. So when you hear those stories, they say X number of people were shot and killed. The perpetrators that are captured are shot and killed themselves. And then they say there are crisis counselors that are on the scene right now, meeting with students, staff, whoever it may be. And when I hear that, it always causes a little bit of a twinge. And I'll tell you why, because it's related to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. If I know that 80% of the people in that school, in that supermarket, in that church are going to be distressed for a few days, maybe weeks, because of what just happened, but in the long run, they're going to be okay. Why do I want to reinforce that memory at the time that it happened? So I'll close it up a little better with what we talked about a few minutes ago. Social support is huge. So you can get those families together after the shooting. You can get those communities together after the shooting. That is going to have a beneficial effect without going straight to the trauma content itself.
That makes perfect sense.
But there's been this idea in the field, it used to be called debriefing, which is let's just get to the meat of the trauma right now.
You haven't even processed it. It just happened.
And the idea is if you address it early enough, then that memory is not going to form. So that association, so if you immediately address it, you're breaking apart the association that's made. But again, I go back to the numbers. If I know most people are going to get better, I'm going to accept the fact that you need to have support there on station. You need to have people interacting with each other and dealing with the emotional aspect of what just happened, but not necessarily getting into the details. And so then you could also, this is a bigger conversation to have, but this idea of, is it healthy or harmful to have a 24-hour news cycle? Because when there is a shooting like this, when there is a natural disaster, and it's covered incessantly around the clock, are you reconsolidating that fear memory for a lot of people, or are you helping them extinguish that fear memory? So my argument would be disengage from all of that coverage, see how it goes for those, few days, weeks after the event, and if you're still having problems, then you can address the memories that remain.
But people, if you look at like the mass media or anything like that, they dump fear on a society. That's like their go-to. Because violent crime and shootings and all these things, like they're down. If you look at statistics over the last 50 years, violent crime is down. A lot of these things are lower, but yet, like you said, 24-hour news cycle. If you want to see tragedy, if you want to see pain, if you want to see suffering, if you want to relive these negative emotions, it is right there in your face on purpose. That's got to be by design. Maybe that's just because it's what drives ratings. I mean, at the end of the day, things that invoke emotion in you are much more likely to get you to engage. If we're just throwing great information out there at you, ways to improve your life, some wealth building habits, people aren't going to really engage that much. They're not, what is it, your limbic system. The way that you feel drives your actions, right? So when social media or any news outlets throw something that enrages you or crushes you, breaks your heart, anything, you're more likely to stay tuned in. And then their advertisers get paid. The whole system works. But we are creating a generation of crippled people.
Right.
The reason I'm so fascinated by this episode, and I want to go as far as we can with this, is like young kids now have like no tools to combat anxiety. There are plenty of kids that come in here that can't even make a phone call without anxiety. And like one of the things that I've witnessed, and I think you've obviously seen in your probably clinical practice or like seeing people firsthand, fear doesn't necessarily change. Like fear is always in the world. And what is a fear to me could be different to you. But the stimulus of fear is eternal. It's since the dawn of time. If you're a living entity that's going to die, there's probably a sense of like, I don't want that. If anything is leading me to that path, I want to avoid it. There's going to be a fear. So if fear is going to be universal, all I can really do is get the people in my life to get braver at their ability to combat what may or may not happen in life.
Right. So that's the one thing we haven't said yet today, which is fear is an adaptive emotion. So we've been talking about the harmful effects of fear and the overexpression of fear and having too much fear. But you need fear to survive, right? So obviously, if you are in theater and you're deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, you want to be vigilant. Fear is adaptive for you because it's going to keep you out of trouble, you would hope.
Yeah, let's say bullets are flying on a field and I say, well, I have no fear, I'm just going to walk out. That's called stupidity. Fear can be a very, very productive thing.
So you're right in the sense that we have to recognize that fear is part of our human experience. We're going to deal with fear at different levels. But to get to what you were saying a second ago, which is there is the adaptive fear, which is, okay, if I'm hiking in the woods and there's a snake that comes across the path, obviously it makes sense biologically for the first response to be fight or flight, right? But then your higher brain cortices engage and you say, wait a second, that's a typical, garden snake. It's non-venomous. I'm fine.
That's the magic.
So you want to default to the fight or flight because you need that quick response, but then you want the follow-up response, which is, are you perceiving this and are you evaluating this situation the way you should?
That's it. That's the snake. That's the I-75. That's everything is, can you make that switch back to being in this reality in this moment right now, using your brain to interpret the situation correctly versus living in a story of what you believe and be controlled by your emotions. The question is like, how do we get people to make that switch?
And the problem is that we also have our human highly developed frontal cortices, which allow us to play the what if game. So all mammals have this fear response system, right? That's engaged. Obviously, if there's a predator or there's a violent threat that's bearing down on you, it's going to activate that system. But with us as human beings, we can activate that system if we think about a job performance, an exam, something that you have coming up. It's going to activate the same parts of the body, but it's completely unnatural in that defensive or that attacking posture that you take on is not going to do anything for your performance at work or for whatever it is that you're concerned about. But it's the same, we only have one way to respond, and that's that fear and stress response system that gets activated. So it's how well can you shut that system down in the acute moment. So, for example, before you're about to go up on stage or before you're about to give your job performance or your presentation at work, it's kicking in your biological systems. You're starting to perspire, you're breathing, and like you said, the reptile brain takes over, and you just can't remember anything of what you're about to present in 5 or 10 minutes. But being able to lean on prior experience. I've done this before. I know most of the people in the room. What's the worst that can happen? I misspeak. Because, and you've probably heard this before, but when you ask people to list their fears, performing or speaking in front of other people is oftentimes before death. So people are afraid to be in front of people performing before they're afraid of, what we're thinking about existentially. And it's what's the worst that could happen? You make a mistake. Okay. And that's rooted in our early human experience, where getting back to this idea of us being social creatures is if you were part of a group, then that enhanced your survivability. If you had an affiliation with a group that gave you resources and you gave them back resources reciprocally, that would help foster your survival. So this idea of being ostracized is what it's at the root of this fear of public speaking, these social fears that we as humans have. Again, you may misspeak, you may drop your notes, your pants might fall down. But again, what's the worst that can happen? Embarrassment? Well, embarrassment is not the same as potential harm or death, but biologically, our body is reacting the same way.
And honestly, it's okay. You almost have to get to a point where you have the confidence to know that it'll be okay. Otherwise, you'll live in the what ifs. It's we're almost tormented and blessed by imagination.
Right.
Because your imagination can imagine things to be the worst ever and create all those responses, or your imagination can propel you to incredible feats and heights and successes. One of the things, I do a lot of speaking. I just spoke actually at Washington, D.C. for the Department of Defense. I did a 45-minute speech. I've done a bunch of keynotes. I've done, graduation speeches. And I don't write a single thing down. Not for a 45-minute speech, nothing. I'll walk up in front of a group of people. I'll know the topic that I'm going to speak on, and I'll speak freely from the heart, genuinely. And it's I've had so many people say to me, how do you do that? Because the fear is gone. I can misspeak.
Right.
I can stumble over a word and then have to say it correctly. I don't need to know the future to trust myself in this situation. If you know your material, you know who you are and what you believe, and it's rooted in some sort of evidence that makes you feel confident to stand upon it, then what is the fear? And it's we're almost approaching the idea that if you want to combat these type of irrational, intangible things, you can't put your finger on fear and hold it. You can't fight it. I can't put it in the ring and be I'll just beat this feeling up and then it'll shut up. You have to root your confidence in yourself, right? So how do you take a patient that has gone through this type of early childhood traumatic situation or PTSD or something like that? How do you build them into that healthy psychological being that's able to walk up on the stage and because all the things you're saying, they're logical to me. I'm not worried about any of those. I walked up and shook the hand of the Department of Defense woman that brought me in and said all right, good luck. And It was I got this. How do you take people that have had these traumas, had these stresses, had these things in their lives? If they come to you, what is the process to build them into the person that looks at it the way that maybe you or I will?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start off by just talking about my own personal experience. So most mental disorders, that we think of, depression, anxiety, have a genetic component to them. And so there's a biological vulnerability people have if their parents or close relatives had a psychological disorder, but there's also the environmental aspects. If your mother raised you with very strict rules and very little room for making mistakes, and you were what we used to call a type A personality, that's how her mother and her parents raised her going back. So there's both an environmental but also a biological component to that. And I bring that up because I come from a very anxious mother, right? And so growing up, just seeing, as we've talked about, her distorted view of the world, which is all these things are bad and terrible, and from potential illnesses to people I want you to stay away from. All these things are bad. And so that was the message that my brother and I were hearing for much of our upbringing, was how dangerous things are and how protected we need to be, right? And so I'm a marathon runner. And so there was back in 2006, Walt Disney World started this thing. They have a marathon every year. They started this thing called the Goofy Challenge, which is you go down there for the weekend. On Saturday, you run a half marathon. On Sunday, you run a full marathon. So 39.3 miles. 39.3.
Thank you.
In one weekend. So I decided I'm going to do this. It's the first time they're doing it. I've been running marathons for a while. I'm going to take on this challenge. And my parents were living in Florida at the time, so my brother and his family went down to Disney World. My parents drove up from South Florida and met us, at Epcot the night before. And so, I'd done a ton of races, and I was in probably some of the best shape of my life. And so physically, I'm ready for this weekend. But also knowing who my mother is, right? So she says, are you ready for tomorrow? I said, yeah, hydrated, I'm eating well. It could be really bad. On Sunday, what happens if, you can't finish the marathon? Or what happens if you have a heart attack? Or whatever, my anxious Jewish mother had in her mind. So I left the restaurant that night, and I'm going back to the hotel, and I'm hearing her words in my head, which I've heard my whole life. And I say to myself, yeah, this could be a really bad weekend. Not likely, because I'm in my 30s. I'm trained for this, not likely, but that seed of doubt that parents like to throw in there. So I say, yeah, this could be really bad. But then this voice in my head stops, and it says, but this could also be the best weekend of your life. This could be one of the greatest accomplishments, at least physically, you've done. On Sunday afternoon, when you have all three of those medals around your neck, you can look in the mirror and say, look what I did. And it was that voice that I took with me in race weekend.
And that's the truth. It could be what your mother said. It could be what you said. It could be somewhere in between. But it's going to be what it's going to be.
Right. So to your point, you have somebody that comes in. Obviously, I don't want to boil down, months and weeks and years of therapy into a small digestible bit, because that's not how it works. But so if somebody comes in and they have anxiety problems, obviously they're over-evaluating the risk of different situations in their life. They're over-evaluating how that's going to affect them physically from a health standpoint. Most people with panic disorder will tell you they have this fear that they're going to give themselves a heart attack during a panic attack. And so you want to break down that distorted thinking. And sometimes this takes a long time, because the default voice that they hear is either their own or their parents or their coaches or their teachers saying, this is bad, and trying to change that to this might not be so bad to this is actually not bad at all.
So they're very disempowered people as well, though, you would say, because they don't have that spring-back voice that comes from within.
So one of the things that we haven't talked about much, we've obviously been talking about learning theory and overcoming your fears by things like extinction and exposure therapy and making that disconnect. But what we're not talking a whole lot about that I really like to focus on is the person that's going through this. Because, you talk about we give person X drug Y to treat condition Z. We do 12 weeks of exposure therapy for PTSD, and we hope their symptoms go down. That all sounds good for this hypothetical patient, but you've got the person in front of you. So at some point you have to ask yourself, can this person do this? Do they have the self-discipline? Do they have the concentration? Have you addressed the potential substance use that's preventing them from engaging in treatment? Have you gotten their mood regulated so that they can get out of bed and come to treatment? So getting the person to be in the situation they need to be best effective at the treatment. And so that raises a point that we like to talk about a lot, which is self-efficacy. Believing that you have the capacity to do this treatment, that it's going to be effective, and that you can then take that moving forward in your life. Because that concept of self is oftentimes where you need to start before you even get into, tell me about the Humvee and where you were. Tell me, and I like the way you started this conversation, is tell me about you, because I want to hear about what your approach has been and how we could potentially change that approach. Because if I'm just giving you predetermined a recipe for here's how we're going to deal with your symptoms and not getting to know what you've been dealing with or what your thought process is, it's not going to be very effective.
1,000%. And I hate to put the healthcare of this country on blast, but that's what's missing is if you got to know the patients and the source of their illnesses and their problems and what is plaguing them, instead of treating the symptoms on the surface, which is just a manifestation of some deeper problem, you could actually try to heal people on a substantial level. But when you have to blanket people. Maybe just for efficacy of the system.
Right.
When you're going to deal with that many people, how in the world do you individualize treatment? Because what you're speaking of is beautiful. It's like getting to see the soul in front of you and figuring out what it is that torments or plagues them and what level of capacity are they at for fear confrontation, for consistency, for self-discipline, for when you walk out of this office, are you going to do what is necessary to fight this battle? It's like, how do you scale something like that? Because you know what does it? These type of conversations, these type of interactions, the two human beings tackling something jointly where one person probably needs a help up. How do we scale a system like that? Because what you're speaking of is exactly right. You need to be able to see the patient for who they are, because how you would treat me and 25 other people that look just like me in an ideal world is very different. How do I process fear? How do I handle difficulty? How do I handle stress in the moment? Do I have clarity in my thoughts? Am I able to really perceive the words that you're saying? When you're speaking to me, is the frequency connecting? Or am I am I in my own head while you're talking to me, telling all these different stories? Or am I really in the current reality listening to the information? It's like, that is the challenge. Because I believe, I've loved this conversation today so much, but psychology is, it's the cure. Like, within the brain is where almost all of these pains start, but within the brain is the cure for this. Now, you might need someone to lead you there. Here's a question for you. And I know might seem like a tangent. How often is a brain chemical imbalance actually the issue for why people need treatment? Because when I was growing up, I remember in the early 90s, we were always told that people that were put on antidepressants and all these things, you have a chemical imbalance. And I'm going to tell you what, that was thrown around anyone that struggled at all to do any activity that was taken, to be prescribed medication was like, you probably just have a chemical imbalance, and if you take these drugs, it'll take the edge off so that you can focus. Ritalin became massive in the country, all kind of antidepressants, Zoloft, all those things. How often have you seen in your clinical practice that it's actually a chemical imbalance and not, let's say we fixed the foundations of their life. We gave them loving relationships. We built their confidence. We did voluntary fear confrontation. How often is it a chemical imbalance that you've seen?
Well, let me start off by saying that is an overgeneralization, to say the least. And what we do know about psychiatric disorders and diagnoses is that they are multifaceted. And the way we look at it is from a biopsychosocial approach. So biologically, are there risk factors like familial history of mental illness? And frankly, to try and detect a chemical imbalance is next to impossible.
Then how can they say things like there's a chemical imbalance?
Well, I'll tell you in a second. There are measures that you can do. You can measure metabolites of neurotransmitters in different bodily fluids, and you can do urinalysis and blood samples. But you're not going to do a blood test and then get that back and say, this is the signature of depression. It just doesn't exist that way. It doesn't, the etiology, the causation does not exist that way.
That makes sense, but yet it's prescribed.
The way that it happened is the antidepressant drugs that showed efficacy. So if you've heard of tricyclic antidepressant drugs, those were the earlier first tried ones. And what they know about those drugs chemically is that they bond to the transporters that bring up neurotransmitters. So our neurons release neurotransmitters into what's called the synapse. Those bond to the next neuron, and then the signal is passed along down whatever brain region and circuit that you're talking about. And so if you were to block the reuptake of that neurotransmitter at the synapse, you've got more neurotransmitter present, but it's not that more neurotransmitter present that's causing the therapeutic benefit, because it takes these drugs oftentimes 2 to 3 weeks to become effective. So it's something much more complicated down the line than simply elevating neurochemicals in the brain. So part of that idea of there being a chemical imbalance is because we knew that the drugs that were effective in treating depression could affect the levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin, like norepinephrine, that have been linked to mood. So we knew that in general, lower levels of those transmitters were associated with depressed mood, higher levels were associated with better mood. These drugs drugs increase those levels, so we're correcting some chemical imbalance. So it's more of a blanket term for what's going on under the hood based on what we were seeing clinically from drugs that were being used and knowing where those drugs acted in the brain and what transmitters they acted on. So you really need to look more in terms of that biopsychosocial approach. Do they have the risk factors that we've identified biologically, like family history? Psycho, that's in terms of their thinking and their behavior. How are they interacting with the world? What does their behavior system look like? Are they effective at their job? Are they effective at school? Are they effective in their roles in the home? How were they raised? What was their value system? What was their, spiritual upbringing? Those are all the psychological factors. And then socially, the impact of culture, the impact of where you grew up, how you grew up, what traditions were. All of those play a role in your later life behavior and potentially maladaptive behavior, what we call disorder. So it's, to say that somebody has a chemical imbalance is alluding a little bit to what we know about the neurochemistry, but there's no definitive, to get back to your question, no definitive test where I send you into the lab, I get the results back, and I say, this is biological depression.
Yeah, and that's not revolutionary to what I would have expected, but it is great to hear you say that, because one of the things, and I'm speaking from an emotional standpoint on this next part, probably because of my mother, and I witness a lot of people that are desperately seeking help, that go to professionals, that they're told the way to treat what you have is this drug. And those people become victims even more. What they need is, I'm broken and I need this drug to be okay. And they don't fix the say that for me again, the three parts.
Biopsychosocial.
Biopsychosocial. They don't fix the biopsychosocial trifecta, which would substantially improve the quality of their lives. They believe that they have to take this pill and that it'll make their brain and depression better. And I believe deeply that is very negatively impacting a lot of people, because the way out of depression is hard work. And it is a dark road, and it is probably a lot of fear, confrontation, and so many uncomfortable moments. But one of the things I tell the fighters a lot now that I would love to talk more about for the actual neurochemistry of this, the feelings in the temporary are very often misleading to the fulfillment in the long term. If you operate based on what feels best in stimulus in this moment in time, you are often so far astray from the path that if you walked down for these different aspects of your life, you would get fulfillment. Your brain's going to release more dopamine. You're going to see that you are in a hierarchy and feel good about your place. You're going to see your vision coming to life, and you're going to feel good about your journey down that road. Because what I tell so many people is listen, if you're at the bottom, you don't need to be at the top. You need to see yourself moving along the line and realizing, I can get better. I can improve. If I couldn't even get out of bed yesterday because the depression was so bad, and today I was able to stand up and go for a walk. I had to do it in peace. It's the progress, not the end result that brings the happiness. I guess just speak more on that. There's so many things to cover here, and the brain is so fascinating. I always talk about neuroplasticity and the fact that, regardless of those traumas you talked about as a child, you said if you were affected by significant trauma as a young child, or if you had taken antidepressants, certain regions of your brain were producing synapses less. Does that mean, though, that they can't relearn to create synapses effectively and better patterns? Because then otherwise, why is it even relevant?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do know about the human brain is that there's a lot of redundancy in the circuitry. So it could be that, a certain brain region doesn't have as many synaptic contacts because of some treatment, drug or otherwise. But it may be that there are other systems in place that can compensate for that, so that it may not be a functional loss, even though it's an anatomical loss. So we do know that.
So you're saying that people, regardless of the past experience, can form these new synapses and still have...
Biologically speaking, yes, you can rewire the brain, what you call neuroplasticity. But what we've been talking about a lot today is what are the barriers to get to that level of neuroplastic change in the brain, whether it's through drug treatment, through therapy. What are the barriers preventing? Is it situational? Is it financial? Is it based on the person's prior history?
But it is possible.
It's possible, but as we talked about earlier, you have situations where the distortions are so great, and so I don't want there to be the sense that somebody who is depressed and can't get out of bed in the morning is making a conscious decision not to get out of bed, because the distortion and the sadness can be so heavy that it is physically impossible to get out of bed. So I don't want to make it seem like they just have to make the choice to get up.
No, if I am coming across as downplaying that, I don't mean that in the slightest. I've been in the darkest, deepest depressions of almost killing myself as a teenager, from moments in my life, from a girlfriend that hung herself, and like, I've been in those moments. I know what that feels like. But there's an extreme light in the dark, knowing that like it is possible,
right,
that you don't need to stay here forever.
Right. And I have an experience with a patient a few years ago, and this gets to your point. So she was, feeling suicidal, and she was dealing with depression for a long period of time. And she also had an upbringing where there was abuse and there was neglect. And so there was what we talked about, that social support was completely missing in her life. And so when she would come in, and so when I saw her on day one, recent suicidal ideation and attempts were not that far back in her history. So she wasn't in imminent danger when I was seeing her, but it was recent enough that it was a concern. And so, of course, the thinking is we want to get her to a place where she's not suicidal, but also we want to deal with this underlying depression. And so one of the times that she came in, I looked, and she had a pretty despondent look on her face, and she was dejected, and it was one of our early sessions. And, I said, "So what did you do today?" And she said, "Well, I got up and I made some cereal and I watched a little bit of TV." And I said, "Stop right there. Do not discount the fact that last week when I saw you, you hadn't gotten out of bed. So stop. Give yourself a little bit of a pat on the back and affirm yourself that today is different than it was last week." So I said, let's not gloss over you only had a bowl of cereal and then came here to see me. That's different than it was last week. So getting to your point, progress. So stop and let's take note of the progress and build on that. And also forewarning that you may get back to a place where you can't get out of bed again, but that doesn't change the progress you've made today. And so that really, again, not to oversimplify, but that is the issue, that you want the gains that you get clinically to stick, right? Whether it's PTSD, depression, substance use. So if you've had a period of sobriety, if you've had a period where you haven't had debilitating anxiety, getting that to stick, but knowing, as plastic as our brains and nervous systems are, there is a potential for backslide. And demystifying and destigmatizing this idea that backsliding is not failure, right? Because if you're going to change any system, biological or otherwise, it's going to take some time for that to be the new normal, for that to be the new baseline.
100%. 100%. Has there ever been a human being ever where every day is a substantial progression or plateau each day of his life? No, we all go up and down. Our mental states go up and down. Your energy levels go up and down. That is normal. It's like back to that truth. Like if you set unreal expectations, well, if I got out of bed today and I can't get out of bed tomorrow, that means no. It doesn't mean anything. Right. That's your current state. So with this client, let's dig a little deeper into this. She first came in, her suicidal ideations were a little bit enough in the past. You had said that you didn't think she was in imminent danger. What was your initial approach to therapy without getting into specifics? Like, you don't need her name or anything. Do you prescribe drugs? Do you prescribe it's time to list out what your life looks like? Do you look at the trifecta of the life? Hey, explain the bio, explain the psycho, explain the social. What do you do to start helping someone that wants to go on this journey?
Yeah, so for the most part, what you'll do at the beginning is what's called an intake appointment, where you are addressing all those biopsychosocial factors. So it's usually 90 minutes. It depends on the time frame, the scheduling, insurance. So all these factors that you talked about with our healthcare system that are actual limitations. But ideally, your intake session is you're getting a complete picture as best you can of that person. What was their childhood like? What was their medical history like? What were their symptoms been like? What has their treatment history been? So you try to get this as big a picture as you can. So I had known based on that intake experience that she had a prior abuse history. She was dealing with bouts of depression. The way depression works for many people is it can be episodic. So you can have 2 weeks or more where you're feeling depressed, but then you can have periods of time for 2 weeks or more where you're not. Or you can have just this long episode of depression that people deal with pretty consistently. So knowing her history and knowing that she had had bouts of depression before but had gotten through them was part of my thinking with this. Let's stop and recognize that you got up out of bed and made breakfast for yourself today, which you hadn't been doing last week. But to also, with this patient, remind her that she's been here before and it actually did get better. So probably the hardest thing for me clinically, because I started as a scientist, and then went to clinical work. We didn't talk about that too much, but I didn't start doing clinical work until more recently, is it is such a process of bringing the horse to water, right? So as much as your instinct is to say, you've done this before, you've gotten through this, is they have to realize that for themselves. And it gets this idea of self-efficacy that we talked about a few minutes ago. It doesn't do them any service for me to prescribe what I think they should do. They need to realize that for themselves. So with her, it was just helping her to see that she had gotten through this before, that this darkness and this heaviness that she was feeling right now, she'd been there before, but she'd gotten to the light, as you were mentioning. So for her, it was a matter of addressing kind of the psychosocial aspects that were going on in her life, school and relationship problems. So again, this idea of distorted thought. There's distorted thoughts and feelings based on what's going on internally, but there's also distorted thoughts and feelings based on what you're hearing in your relationships. If it's an abusive relationship, if you're being put down all the time, clearly that person is not going to have that self-efficacy if they're being put down versus if they're in a relationship that is positive and how can we get through this and that kind of thing. So for her, the relapse into depression had a lot to do with what was going on in her life. So to simplify it, to get to your question, was really addressing how are you going to deal with this situation, and then what are we going to take from this situation that we can apply the next time. And again, I don't want to oversimplify, but if you can get to a consistent sense of self and recognize that you are going to experience fluctuations in your life, good and bad, but to have a stable baseline. And I know for those clinicians who may be listening, I'm not trying to oversimplify this, but if you can get a stable baseline to return to, then those highs and lows don't feel like that is the consistent and the normal place to be.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be rude to any clinicians that hopefully watch this, but I'm gonna just say this as bluntly as possible. Yes, you can't oversimplify something that is so insanely complex, like the brain and depression and all of these things. You can't oversimplify that, but you can pull similarity from difficulty, from healing, from therapy. You can pull what are the themes that move people in the right direction. And if we're afraid to speak on those things, then how do we give clarity to the people that are searching for them? If we say like, well, it's super complex, it's difficult, right, here's a bunch of terminology, good luck. If you want to change the mental health of the nation and the world, you have to pull basic tenets of what good mental health looks like, and you have to broadcast those. Now, you can throw it out with an asterisk that says, not all cases will be this, blah, blah, blah. Right. But you need to say things like confronting your fears, living in a non-distorted reality, objectively viewing the things in your life. Would you say, here's another question for you, a strong belief system, whether it's right or wrong, faith, principles that you stand on, to align yourself with. If I'm just floating through this existence without a real defined line on what I believe to be right and wrong, what I believe to be a worthy pursuit, then I'm just making decisions in the moment without I don't have structure behind it. Versus if I know who I am, my belief system, what I hold as valuable, what I hold as evil, what I hold as incorrect for my life, it almost takes no thought in most activities I do because there's already an alignment. Do you think that having things like that, whether it comes from religion or it comes from within, that, how would I best phrase this, that posture you correctly to take on the world is essential to being able to beat back the darkness?
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. One is, and this was raised earlier, the idea that needs to be more familiar and less stigmatized is the idea that mental health is health, right? So I just came back from the Air Force Academy where I spent a year as a visiting professor. And part of the reason I went there was because in dealing with PTSD, almost universally up until last year, most of the people I saw were after the fact, after they had been traumatized. So civilians, service members, veterans, how do we deal with the traumatized brain and the traumatized person? What I hope to do when I went to the Air Force Academy was here is a collection of 4,000 cadets who are obviously yet to be deployed because they're still developing into service members. How can we build a sense of resilience in these individuals so that, because again, we know that resilience, social support, to use military terms, camaraderie, those types of aspects are essential to being a healthy person. So I had lunch with the dean of the Air Force Academy 2 weeks ago. And essentially she was asking me, what's your take home from your experience? What's your rose, your thorn, in terms of your experience? And I said, and I realized that I'm fighting an uphill battle here, but it's all about changing the idea that mental health does not mean mental illness. So the analogy that I gave her was, if on day one you put 1,000-pound barbell in front of the cadets and said, lift that over your head, no one's going to be able to do it, obviously. So to use that analogy, you would say, okay, over the next 4 years, we're going to build your strength to the point where on graduation day, when the president is speaking to you at commencement, you're going to lift that bar over your head. Same thing with mental health. So, and again, I'm at the risk of oversimplifying. The military mindset is a warrior mindset. The idea is if you wash out, you washed out for a reason. You couldn't hack it. It's good that we washed you out now instead of when you're an F-16 fighter pilot because I don't need you losing it up there. But if they don't have the tools, you're going to knock them on day 2 for not lifting the 1,000 pounds, but you've not told them how to do it or conditioned them to do it. So I said, we have to change this culture so that when mental health is physical health. So if you have them required to do PT as part of their cadet experience, then they should be required to do MT, do the mental health training as well.
Seth, that is such a home run that I'm going to clip that section by itself and post that because that is the entire point. You just made an analogy click into my brain. Imagine if we said, I'm going to make it into mixed martial arts. Seth, we're going to throw you in the ring with a professional fighter, and it's going to be on this day. Actually, it's in 3 days, and you're going to go step in the ring with one of my best pros, and you need to make it through the experience. You're going to get slaughtered. You're going to get killed because you aren't fully prepared for what is coming your way. Looking at it this way, like the military, the warrior mindset, warrior comes from within. Some of the strongest, toughest people I've ever met aren't even very physically dominant at all, but they are like bulletproof in their mind. We need to get to a place where you know how I train people to be prepared for the hell that they can experience in a cage where someone's trying to break their face and limbs and knock them unconscious in front of their family and friends? In the lead up, all of the work that's done beforehand creates the warrior. It's almost like if we could get to society or military members in your application, but really what it is if you could get to children and you could teach them about having a sword, a shield, and some armor, they're able to fight the battles that will be ahead of them. These are the mental tools. These are the you used a physical example. It's like, hey, can you lift that barbell? It's like, no, I definitely can't. I don't have the physicality. The mind is the same, is it not? You have to prepare it to be able to handle the stresses and difficulties and pain and grief, and because that stuff's coming.
Right.
We don't get to avoid it. It's like your service members will most likely face things that are going to be traumatic to them. So how do we build them to have armor, have swords, and have shields, and be prepared for these battles?
Right.
You just hit a home run. That's what needs to happen. It's like we're reactive. We're trying to do things in post, like how do we fix mental health, when really the best solution is probably building the best physical, mental, and spiritual people in advance for what life is going to throw at them. Imagine if this was in every school. Imagine if in every school, one of the classes you had to take growing up in this country was about your mental health, was about resiliency, was about courage, was about fear confrontation, was about not distorting reality for what you want it to be, but seeing it exactly as it is and making peace with that, and asking questions like, what can I do about it if I don't like it? If we got to children and got to military members before they went through these hellish experiences, we'd probably cure most of our problems. That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
And the problem is, once you use that word mental, the stigma, again, if it's warranted or not, from parents, school boards, communities, so wait, you're doing what to my kid? What about mental illness?
You're brainwashing him? What is this? What is that? It
Right.
can go all different directions. Oh, he's weak, he's sick, he needs this, No, it's a factor. Imagine, I'm a big video game player. You mentioned video games earlier. If I was going to build a video game character, I'm not going to max out his physical strength and not have intelligence and charisma and all the other attributes that he needs, because the game and challenges will require that I have attributes in those areas or I will fail. It's the same thing with the mind. It should be like just your mind state, or call it whatever you want, but it is absolutely something that we don't, maybe because it's intangible. You can't just see it. Yeah, I can't see the physicality that you bring to the table and say, like, depression has no face. You could be depressed. I could be depressed. Anybody could be depressed, no matter what you look like. You could be the most beautiful person in the world and be in a prison cell of your own mind. And if we learn to view it that way as a country, and it's like, this is the game changer, man. Because a lot of the frustrations that I was speaking on is that I see great people that are just completely broken and completely disempowered, and they 100% believe that they do not have the tools to fix their life. They need therapy. They need these drugs. They need this. They need that. And maybe you do. Maybe you need that help. Maybe. But maybe if the quality of your relationships, if you fixed damage that was among your family, if you had conversations that are super hard, if you felt better about your place in the world, maybe you would view yourself as capable of getting out of these moments. So let's talk about right now in your current capacity. You just had that meeting 2 weeks ago. You have a vision for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. How does this manifest out? If you are, let's say you're given the reins. They flat out say, Seth, we're going with your method. How are you going to train the resiliency for things that, like, you can't see the fear. You don't know the exact situation. How do you build the people going into it?
Yeah, I think you alluded to it earlier. It's the idea of resilience is it gets back to self-efficacy. So this idea that you convince yourself that you have the means to solve the problem, whether it's by yourself or by enlisting help from other people. So part of resilience is this idea that I am going to face challenges, but based on my experience and who I believe I am, I can face this situation. Now, one of the things we haven't talked too much about, but we've alluded to, is avoidance. And so it's much easier. You mentioned a few seconds ago having that difficult conversation. It's obviously much easier to avoid the difficult conversation. It's much easier to avoid going into therapy for whatever problems you're having. And it gives you an immediate sense of relief. So, we were talking earlier today about this idea of temporary feelings versus permanent fix or a permanent solution. So the temporary feeling of by avoiding the difficult stuff is easier. And that's what, through the same kinds of learning principles, you're rewarding yourself by not having to deal with the bad thing. So I'm going to keep avoiding the bad thing. So part of resilience is facing the bad things, or at least preparing yourself for what those bad things might look like. And, being a parent myself now and watching my kids and their friends and siblings develop, you can really see these factors at play. And you can really see what kids are reflections largely of their parents, especially if you meet the parents and see a lot of the same behaviors, and what are behaviors that are more, let's say, independent. And so I think one of the things that our society has done is it's become so meritorious, for lack of a better word. The idea that you need to be achieving to be successful, and it's gotten certainly worse with the onset of social media, because what you have is people trying to put their best face forward all the time, and it's by extension going to their kids. Show me your accolades, but don't show me any of your warts. So what happens is the kids that are growing up in this generation are seeing nothing but the positives, seeing nothing but the polished, Facebook-ready, public-facing person, and none of the warts, none of the struggle, none of the conflict, and certainly none of the people saying, yeah, I've fucked up before, I've had hard problems, I've lost jobs, but look where I am now. That all gets whitewashed because of this, show me the medals, show me the smiling faces, but let's not talk about the dirty stuff. And that plays a role, especially when people deal with difficult situations, because their automatic thought is, if I fail at this, I've failed as a person, or I've failed my parents, or I've failed. So I'm not even going to address the possibility of failing, where again, I'm oversimplifying, but this is the theme of our conversation today, is recognizing shortcomings for what they are, recognizing setbacks for what they are. And I'm sitting here today telling you that for 27 years of my life, I was listening to those negative thoughts, and I was hearing my parents' voice and not my own voice. And so I was deferring to, well, this is not how dad would have done it. Or if mom saw me now, she'd be ashamed, mad, whatever it might be. So this idea that you can't confront mistakes, you can't confront shortcomings, where the more powerful position is, yeah, I lost that job. And again, as human beings, we talk about attribution. So it's easier, again, avoiding the difficult conversation, to say, my boss was a dick. I lost that job because our personalities clashed, rather than, you know what, I showed up late. It wasn't my priority. I had other things that I was dealing with at the time, so my work suffered and I ended up losing that job. Because it's harder to admit that, because the sense of self that we talked about a few minutes ago is not stable enough to say, that's not who I am. That's a situation that occurred, that happened to me, but I can build on it in these ways. And I think when you focus on the trophy case and not what's behind the trophy case, all that stuff gets lost or swept under the rug. So to tie that back to what we were talking about earlier, this idea of resilience is recognizing that as a whole person, you're going to have successes, you're going to have failures. Who you are is the sum of all of those things. And so one analogy I like to use is, let's say that somebody just didn't have a stellar report card in middle school and high school, C, B, C student, but they were clearly underachieving, okay? So they may tell you during those middle school and high school years, Miss Angeles was a bitch. I mean, she just, her class was hard. She didn't teach it the right way. She didn't, but to be able to say, you know what? No, I spent a lot of time playing video games. I spent more time, practicing baseball than maybe doing my studies. And hopefully recognizing that at some point, making that switch. Okay, that's what I did before for all these reasons, but moving forward, I'm going to place more emphasis on what is important to me. So you're not sweeping that under the rug, you're adding it to your repertoire or your mosaic of what your life has been. So rather than saying it's either number one, first place, or nothing, it's here's my body of work. Here are my shortcomings, here are my successes, here's where I feel like I am today, and then having some kind of objective voice, friend, therapist, someone you can confide in to say, this is how I view myself. What do you think? And we're so afraid to ask that, what do you think?
Man, where do I want to go with this? Not to oversimplify again, but isn't that back to like distorted truth? Because everything that you were just saying right there, you can say your boss was an asshole. Maybe he was. But that has no relevance to, were you at your best? Were you giving your best? Were you showing up on time? Were you learning to add value to the company? Is if you had done those things, would the result be the same? In our society, I think we're actually going the opposite direction. Isn't that where like participation awards come from? You don't want the person to admit when the number one kid is crushing everybody that he's better, because it's easier to discount his work. It's easier to be like, you know what, you're all winners. And maybe that damages mental health. Because like if you can't look at your life, I mean, this is a hard statement to have, and so I'm trying to be careful with my words, but I'm just going to say it as blunt as I can. It is what it is. If it upsets people, that's fine. If you're low level or low caliber, or you have very poor self-efficacy, you have to be able to admit that fully to then make progress on it. When you don't take responsibility for where you are in your contributions to your own situation, how will you change them? You're witnessing a method of thinking of telling little kids today. I do reaching higher through local schools, and I work with the local court system too. They get flooded with the idea that like, you are just what you want to be. You want to know how you work on being confident? I got into a light argument at a mentor session because one of the mentors said, if you want to work on your confidence, affirmations, like say in the mirror, like, I am confident. And I said, like, that's delusional. If you get up every day and you say to yourself, like, I am confident, you're going to go into a setting and prove to yourself that you are not, in fact, confident. And all those affirmations that you're saying in the mirror did nothing. It in no way changed your mental health. If anything, it might be more daunting because you just someone told you, get up, look at yourself in the mirror. Short-term feeling, it probably feels good to be like, I am confident. You know what? Next time this bully tries to do this or that, or next time my boss, and then you prove that you're not. I can become confident, and then maybe you have to set out on that journey of building confidence. But it's back to the distorted reality that as soon as you don't accept things as they are and you don't take the responsibility to actually adjust your part in the puzzle. Because going to your example, had you been the best employee that you could have been, could things have been different? What if you confronted your boss about the things that troubled you? What if you had those difficult conversations? What if you made sure to set an alarm so you could go to bed and be there on time? Then how would that situation have gone? When I'm seeing these things across society where you're like telling kids, like, because mental health is the biggest talking point in schools right now. I don't know if you know that. Like, you're military and you're clinical, you're very high level. I'm nowhere near your level. The number one talking point in schools is like, how do we make kids feel better? But what I'm witnessing is the things that they're doing to make them feel better in the short term is damaging them more in the long term. I witnessed a race recently at the state finals for my fiance's son's cross-country thing. The girl that came into first place, it was a girl. She smoked. I'm sorry, this was the women's only race, so I'm watching her. She smoked the other girls. This girl finished like 30 seconds ahead of every other competitor. She got maybe 15 people that applauded a little bit as this girl poured her heart out and crossed the thing. The people in last place got an unbelievable standing ovation. And why am I bringing that up? Why is that relevant? Our society now is almost rewarding, like, or if you're suffering, you're this or that, like, it's okay, you're a winner, you did it, you're awesome. What about the person that poured their heart and soul, probably from the time she was young, into being the type of runner that gaps people by 30 seconds? My point with this is, I think we're weakening people for what life has in store by giving them what feels good in the short term. It is much easier to tell the kid that is clearly not a winner, that doesn't have resiliency, that doesn't have skill, that is going to, if they go out in the real world, a boss is going to say, like, you have no consistency, you're not this, you're not that, you're fired, get out of here. And then guess what? Their life is going to fall to shambles. If they've been told the whole time they're growing up, you're already this, you're that, you're good, you're great the way you are. I think that's damaging. I think it's better to not distort reality and say, no, you are not a high-level football player right now. That doesn't mean you can't become one, but this is what the path to that is going to look like. Do you see the relationship in that? Do you think by softening things, and let's say everybody's a winner, in the several places they weren't keeping score in games, everybody is successful. In my opinion, that will damage mental health the same way that comparison will. Looking at people's highlights on social media and thinking that's their life. You're discounting what it took to get there. If you see someone with an unbelievable car, there's a lot of hell to get to that car.
Yeah. You raise a lot of interesting points there, and I could go in a number of different directions.
Any of them. Please take any of them, because you're the expert. I am not. I'm only witnessing anecdotally from what I witness. I witness kids getting weaker and weaker and weaker mentally, and they crumble at the slightest adversity. But yet we're telling them, you're loved, you're winners, you're all great, you have all this value. Well, then why don't they believe it?
Yeah, and so, we talk about this idea of schema, in your life and where you fit in. And so I mentioned several times today that, we're social creatures. And so as part of being social creatures, we compare ourselves to other people, social comparison. In certain applications, some people will compare themselves to somebody who is not performing academically as well or athletically as well because it makes you feel better about who you are, downward comparison. So there's always this recognition that we fit somewhere in this hierarchy. And some of this that I'm going to say in the next few minutes is, based on academic and scientific experience, and some of this is my own personal thoughts. So I just want to put that caveat in there. So when you're talking about what you've been calling truth or a realistic assessment of who you are, that realistic assessment of who you are has to include those extremes. And what I mean by that is the best and the worst and where you fit within that. And so, an old social psychologist mentor of mine said that 90% of the people think they're better than average. Well, if you think about the math, that just doesn't work. So having that realistic understanding that your performance academically, occupationally, financially fits on a continuum, and there are always going to be these extremes. So I grew up in a time where you went to graduation, the valedictorian had something to say, they probably mentioned the salutatorian, and then they called the rest of the names. But you knew, sitting in that audience, that there was, by at least that definition, highest grade point average, the best student in the class. And you would look at that, obviously, and say, that's not me, so I'm not the best student in the class. And back in those days, I don't know, I assume they're still doing this, they would rank you. So in my graduating class, there was 420 people, I think. And so you knew where you were in that list of 420.
Do you think that's good or bad for people's psychology?
So I think the realism needs to be there. So I'm getting to your point because I have, we didn't talk about this yet, but I have triplets. So I have 14-year-old triplets. So 2 boys and a girl. And they are going into high school this fall, and so they're just finishing middle school this week. So coincidentally, tomorrow is their 8th grade graduation or promotion. I forget which term they're using. And
my
so my
fiance's son is in 8th grade and just graduated too. Are you here in Brighton?
No, I'm in Grosse Pointe.
Oh, I was going to say, they might be at the same school. Okay, got it.
So my wife and I have this conversation, it's half kidding but half serious. And I say, why are we celebrating something that's expected? 8th grade graduation is not a thing. Like you go from 8th grade to 9th grade.
Never was when we were growing up.
So, and at least in this area, I don't want to speak for, different parts of the country, but it's a big deal. Like, my in-laws are coming today. And so the way I look at it, and this is where I get into the science versus my own personal beliefs, is I don't know why we're recognizing this because it's expected, again, I don't want to fall victim to privilege and all the other things that come into play, socioculturally speaking. But the expectation, at least in, our society today with our elementary school, secondary school, high school, and then potentially college or occupation. But the idea is you go through 12 years of school at least and you graduate high school. I mean, that's what the system is built on. So I don't know why we're taking pause at year 8. Again, this is largely my belief system, but I don't know why we're recognizing something that is part of the overall process. So, but that it's similar to this idea of participation trophies. So my kids all play on sports teams. And I also noticed in the last several years that rather than, most valuable player, most improved player, everybody gets a medal or everybody gets a trophy. And the trophy no longer says whatever the designation was. It's just, Braden did youth soccer in Grosse Pointe when he was 12 years old. Here's his trophy. So I can see some of the rationale in doing that, and that you don't want to quash that sense of independence. You don't want to quash that drive in those children that is still forming. So you don't want to prevent them from developing as an athlete, as a scholar.
Were we prevented from doing that, though, when we lived in a different world?
I'm playing devil's advocate. So the argument would be if you don't recognize everybody, then Johnny Smith here, who wasn't recognized, could have been a stellar athlete or academic, but was somehow blunted in his development because he wasn't recognized. Again, devil's advocate. Whereas the realism is we are, as much as we want to admit it or not, in a meritocracy. Those who do well academically, those who do well financially, those who do well athletically are going to succeed in most, from what we've seen. Usually that spans more than one domain. You're high functioning in several domains of your life. So there is something to be said about Jane Smith was the valedictorian. She had a 4.0, 4.2 weighted if you want to go with some of these systems they're using. She is by far an outstanding student. I have a 3.8. I'm in the top 25% of my class. I'm going to X university in the fall. So if we use the continuum idea that I was talking about, I can still view myself in realistic terms to say I'm a high performer. I've got high potential ahead of me. Here are some of the areas I need to work on if I need to work on them to be Jane Smith the valedictorian. But again, what's the difference between us, and is it a difference that needs to be addressed at all? I would argue that in some cases it's not. You're just splitting hairs eventually. So having this sense of where you are on a continuum, and this dovetails with what I was saying earlier in terms of having a baseline sense of self, is this idea that, by the measures that are imparted on me, I've done well academically. Here's areas of my life that I can improve. But again, looking at my mosaic, I can feel good about where I stand. And I think what happens is either through media, through parents, through school systems, the focus is being placed on one element and not the overall mosaic. And so just to get back to what we were saying a second ago, some of this is pie in the sky speaking. Some of this is simplifying very complex issues. But if we can use a more global evaluation, so we talked about biological, psychological, sociocultural. If we can use that lens to have a more realistic sense of self, and again, this is going to take much more than a 50-minute session with a therapist or a psychiatrist or a healthcare provider.
I mean, that's the ultimate goal, though, right?
So to not go off on a tangent when people say that, so-and-so is in therapy, I personally am a proponent of therapy. I think everybody can benefit from therapy. Getting back to the point I was saying a minute ago, which was mental health is not mental illness. So if I'm going to therapy to be a better father, to be a better husband, to be a better friend, to be a better person, I'm not trying to correct an impairment. I'm trying to thrive in who I am as a person. And I think that gets lost as soon as that word mental gets thrown in there. It's like, wait a second, what's wrong with this person? Well, no, there's nothing wrong. So again, you asked me what I would do to build resilience is incorporating mental health into curricula to help people thrive. There's a field called positive psychology, which is the antithesis of clinical psychology, which is where's the problem and how do we fix it? Here's the person, how do we make them the best person that they can be? That's what I'm talking about in terms of building resilience, is addressing those areas that are for far too long been thought of as being areas of concern to me to be addressed, not areas of who the person is holistically.
And why is it wrong? Let's say someone is clearly not a very good basketball player. We're going to give every single person a trophy. Why is it wrong tell the kid that you are lower on the tier.
Right. I don't think it is. I think the conversation is, this is clearly not your strength. You've got a lot of strengths.
Or perhaps, how do we get you better? Was Michael Jordan not cut
Right,
from his high school basketball team? What if they gave him a participation award and said, oh, you're just as good as everyone else, and he didn't go back and cry in his room and spend hours upon hours working on his craft and develop a type of character and resilience that you never see, and a type of conviction to his cause that made him the greatest of all time? Ideals shouldn't be cut down because most people don't achieve them. And that's what you're witnessing. You see a valedictorian and these emotional people that have no understanding about what it takes to build a human being to being healthy say, if we show an ideal and everyone else that falls short of that ideal will feel bad. Guess what? Good. If you don't like the way you feel about your present situation, that is a stimulus that is likely to drive action to, if I want to play football and I'm getting slaughtered on the football field and I'm genuinely passionate about trying to get better at the game, I'm going to then say, clearly my current capacity and level is not adequate. And if I would like to be good at this, I'm going to have to put the work in. The moment you tell me, everyone's great, here's your reward, I don't want to say that you're the most valuable player because that might make James feel bad. Undercutting ideals weakens people overall, and it takes away the stimulus that is meant to be a driver towards success. Whoever told you that driving to extreme success would be an easy feel-good process? They lied to you. It's not going to be that way. You're going to have to look at your own inadequacies and your own shortcomings. And no matter how we distort the truth, everyone knows it. If you're in a class, and let's say we're no longer ranking kids, because I don't think they are, you know, if you suck, like, I hate to be blunt like that, but if you suck, you are getting terrible grades, you're not doing well, maybe because you're putting no effort in, or maybe you are putting a lot of effort in, your intelligence is just at a different level. You know it regardless, and so does everyone else. The truth doesn't change whether we acknowledge it or not. This is not a table because whether or not we acknowledge it. It is what it is. Now, if we say, well, don't say that because whatever reason, and we distort the truth, you're weakening the people's ability to build themselves because of the truth. If you see that girl on the stage and she is better than you, and you're like, yeah, but don't use those words. I'm only talking about in this specific her ability to follow the process to get higher grades than you. Maybe as a functional human being, when you look at the spheres that you talk about, that is where you should build your confidence from. Maybe you're a better friend. Maybe you're a better worker. Maybe you have this. But objectively, she's better than you at this. Do you want to change it? Do you want to improve? Are you content with if you're at a 3.8, I'm content. But let's say I'm at a 2.5 and I'm looking at that valedictorian, I'm going, I want that. I want to do better. That is a positive stimulus versus cutting. What we are in the process of doing is cutting ideals to make people feel better. Don't look to the top of the pyramid of a hierarchy because it will make you realize that you are not the top. Good, because otherwise the world will. If I told you you're an amazing singer, Seth, you're an amazing singer every time, just to make you feel good, every time you open your mouth to sing, I was like, you're the best. You might go try to get a record label. You might try to follow those delusions to only find out, I'm actually not a great singer. Why did this guy tell me that the whole time? Distorting the reality to try to make you feel better in the short term is probably detrimental to your mental health. Because what about now when you dedicate to this false belief and you go try to accomplish this career and everyone that you sing in front of says, bro, you suck. Like, you're not good. That is a major problem. And I'm witnessing, I had another doctor on my podcast. I won't cite her by name, but she was very big into like the, all the things that you were like lightly starting to speak to about like inclusivity and like everyone just needs to feel like a winner. And like, it's almost hard to sit and listen to because people are not the same. Everyone is not a winner. Everyone is not great at a large variety of things, but that doesn't mean that you can't make progress down whatever journey you want to. You could start from the most bottom level, psycho state and work your way to amazing mental health. You could start from you have no real skills. You are barely, you got through the tutorial school mode of life and you come out in the world and you have nothing really to offer, and you could build into a tremendously impactful, valuable human being that betters every situation you go into. But you have to objectively look at the truth of where you're at to know what path. Otherwise, how do I make a roadmap towards my success if I can't even evaluate where I actually am on the hierarchy? And I feel like nobody is speaking like this anymore. And what I'm witnessing, or some people are, there are people, when I say nobody, the majority, the general narrative is more about catering to the momentary feelings than putting people in a place that is much better for them in the long run.
Yeah, and I think part of that has to do with how you operationally define the situations that we're in. So, for example, I use this term realism earlier. So, if your son or daughter comes home and they have the 2.5, the C grades, and you say, okay, let's dive into this. You've got a C in Spanish. Why do you think that is? And, what do you expect to hear? You expect to hear, Senora is a bitch. She's not, receptive to us. Excuses. And so then, and again, I'm as a parent speaking ideally, because it's hard to do in the moment, but you're saying to yourself, I need you to tell me honestly, how much did you study Spanish this past week? And then, you'll get the teenage response, I studied hours, but I saw you playing video games and I saw you go down to the high school with your friends. I saw you out in the back swimming in the pool. Like, when was Spanish happening? So that's a critical moment where, and again, this is part of maturity, the 14-year-old brain obviously is, a mishmash of wiring and neurochemicals. But that's what I want, at least my kids, and I would hope, this is part of the developmental process where that realization occurs, that inner voice kicks in and says, it's time to stop bullshitting myself. I'm not putting in the effort. If I put in the effort, then I would be a better student, athlete, whatever. So I think that realistic appraisal of who you are and where you are is important for the reasons that you're saying, which is, okay, you've been sitting on the bench for 3 seasons now in baseball. All these other players have been playing and developing. What do you think the issue is? And again, you'll get the typical adolescent brain that says, well, Joey's the coach's son, and this person's been playing with that coach for this long, and, he's just bigger, stronger, whatever it might be. But honestly ask yourself.
The truth. What is the truth?
How often have you been batting in the backyard, hitting off a tee? How often have you been asking me to go to the batting cages? Like, again, you're not going to be at that level if again, there, and you have to admit, and this gets what we were saying a few minutes ago, that there are God-given differences in people, right? So somebody can pick up a bat and be crushing him to the outfield with very little instruction. You're not going to match that at face value. You can get there with the work that you put into it on the tee and in batting practice. So I agree with you that having those ideals is helpful. But with the caveat being, where are these ideals coming from and how realistic, how grounded are these ideals? And this gets in kind of the issue that we deal with a lot with adolescents, which is image in general. If the ideal is, I want to be a 280 hitter who's playing on my JV and then my varsity team, and if I'm, fortunate and skilled enough to play in college, that would be great. Not the ideal is the exception to the rule, the wunderkind, the athlete who didn't have to put a whole lot of work into it and got all kinds of accolades. Again, so having an objective sense of who the ideal is and knowing what the ideal story was. And so, again, having this realistic appraisal, who you are, where you can go, and having those people in your life, like the coaches and the teachers that say, you know what, I got to be honest with you. I just don't see violin in your future. You're all thumbs. You've been doing this all semester, almost a year now. Let's try another instrument, try another activity. This just doesn't work. Instead of, let's all celebrate our spring violinists as a whole, which is typically how it's done. I'll give you one quick story, which is, my kids' elementary school, and this is in line with what we've been talking about, have an awards ceremony every year. and including, whatever it was, fifth grade graduation, which isn't a thing.
It is now, actually, I think. I think they do
I know
elementary
they do,
graduations
right,
and celebrate
right.
them.
But end of the year, they'll say, okay, the following students are being awarded for highest grade point average in social sciences. And 15 kids stand up. You say, thought this was the highest. So what they did was they set this criteria of, 90%. All the students who got 90% above in social science are getting this award for highest. That's not the highest. So to your point, you're placing a label on far more kids than is appropriate, where it's better for Jimmy 89% to know you've got a little bit more to go for you're an A student, or there is a difference between, your effort and your grades and what's
and it is uncomfortable. It might suck to realize that. It might suck to realize you're not as good as someone else. That is life. Yeah. I can't want to be 6'4". Oh, I just hate that. If you're 6'4", you have natural advantage over me. I don't get to distort the reality of it. And now that's a simple thing to accept because you can visually see it. But like you said, there's God-given talents. There's all kind of things that you just don't. We are not the same. And to try to box everyone into we just want to give everyone the same feeling so they have the same chance, you're misleading them. You're misleading people by doing that. The more you can help them, as you said, rationally view their position within the world with an endless number of hierarchies. Just because you're not the athlete doesn't mean that you won't trample the world of professionalism or business or something. Who knows? But if we try to mislead you by your temporary feelings, you are in for far more disappointment, like when you go for your singing audition. These are the things. So much of this, not to simplify, is truth and simple, realistic, whether it is uncomfortable or not. That's not the question. I have a certain advantage because I'm raising, my fiance has a son and she's the first woman I had ever dated. We're going to be married. I've been with her 7 years. She's the woman for me, love of my life. I had never dated anyone with a child before. And he came into my life when he was very young. He's 14 now. His name's Braden, by the way. Is that the name of your son or did you just... Yeah. His name is Braden, by the way. So when you said that, I'm like, what? Anyway, it's almost much easier for me to parent him because, yes, I love him and care about him. He's been in my life now 7 years. I watched the kid grow up. But there's a disconnect on the level of, I can just objectively try to be the best leader and mentor for him without, all the emotional strings of, well, I don't want to see my child, upset or, I just want him to have his best shot at being the best man that he can be in this world. And let him know that, that's okay, dude. If you're chasing after this ideal and you never achieve it, what you become in the process of chasing that ideal is far greater than what you would be if you didn't chase the ideal, or if I lied to you and just said, your current endeavor is sufficient. Even though you're giving 15% of what you have to give, you know what, buddy? You're doing your best. No, that's not true. There is more. And maybe in your capacity right now, maybe it is your best. But that doesn't mean that best can't be made better, which is a weird term because I'm like you. If you say the highest GPA to me and more than one person stands up, they better be tied. Because otherwise, it is factually inaccurate. And I feel like so much of this, we are witnessing a country that has an anxiety epidemic, a mental health crisis. You are witnessing kids that cannot take their proper place in the world. But a lot of it is because their brains are so out of touch with reality. They don't want to accept things exactly as they are because they might not like that reality. If you don't accept things the way they are right now, you can't have a proper footing to seek out what you want.
No, I think that's a great point to make. When we talk about anxiety in general, one of the underlying themes of anxiety as an emotional state, but also as a disorder, is what's going to happen if event X, Y, or Z happens in my life. So if someone has health anxiety, what if I get this disease and I'm, debilitated or potentially it's life-threatening? Or what if I lose my job and then I lose my mortgage, my house, my spouse, and all that? So this anxiety is when I get to a point of apprehension, of worry, of trepidation, whether it's acute, like the anxiety you have about I've got a big presentation at work tomorrow. And if I screw this up, then my career trajectory is potentially affected. Again, not my livelihood necessarily, not my well-being. But anyway, when this event comes my way that I'm thinking about in my life, that's how we think about anxiety. Is not, so fear is, if there's a stimulus coming at you that has potential to harm you, that's, fear of a specific object or situation.
Probably more rational, right?
A little more rational as long as it's within the context that you're in.
If I have a knife and I'm coming at you, it's very rational to feel
Yeah.
that feeling.
So I may have fear of you coming at me with a knife, but I may develop an anxiety for situations where an attacker might be present. And again, getting back to this idea we were talking about before, where it's adaptive to have some level of anxiety. Because if you're walking down the street happy-go-lucky and not expecting anything and not being vigilant at all, that's not adaptive. So you bring up a great point, and this touches on what we were saying a few minutes ago about sociocultural influences, because what society views, how society defines terms like success, like achievement, plays a long, consistent role in anxiety. So if anxiety is, how am I going to deal with this situation that is potentially unprecedented or unfamiliar? I don't want to fall on my face. Let's simplify anxiety. If your culture is one that has a warrior ethos, for example, or is like the Aleutians where it's very communal and you know that you've got the strength of the community behind you, then your anxiety is going to be less because of the cultural situation you're in. Whereas, let's bring up my example with my mom. If you were raised in a family, in a household where anxiety was prevalent over the smallest things, then your bar is much lower. So if we as a society, as a public, are dictating what the threshold is for being successful, for achieving, versus what is anxiety provoking, if somebody has been told they're doing what they need to be doing, they're competent across different aspects of their life, and all of a sudden they're faced with a challenge, it produces anxiety. So very early on in my clinical training, I asked one of my mentors, I said, I live in this upper middle class neighborhood, and a lot of the people that I'm talking to have, let's just say, privileged anxiety, which is, how am I going to pay for that second home? How am I going to pay for my kids to go to school? So, upper level, high achieving anxiety. Versus I was going to Grady Hospital, which is in downtown Atlanta. It's the primary trauma hospital in Atlanta. And the patients that I was dealing with as part of my training, we're just trying to find food. We're trying to find financial security, a home. So I said to my mentor, how do you reconcile seeing the upper middle class patient who says they're anxious about their finances when their finances, they're anxious about what they can add to what they already have, versus this patient in inner city Atlanta who's saying, I'm anxious about my finances because I don't know if I can pay the rent. I don't know if I can put food on my table. I said, how do you reconcile that as a therapist? And he said, the way you look at it is how debilitating the anxiety is in their individual situations. So, to your point you were saying earlier, subjectively, this person in upper middle class suburban Atlanta who's worried about making a second car payment may be just as debilitated within his context as the person who doesn't know how they're going to make the next rent payment. So as a therapist and as a clinician, you've got to deal with that context. So to get to your point, if as a society we're saying everyone's on an equal playing field until you get to your first year of college, your first job, your first intercollegiate athletic performance, and you fall flat on your face, how you deal with it is, did you fall flat on your face before? Were you forewarned of what falling on your face is going to look like? Or did you fall on your face in fourth grade where you weren't best in the class? You weren't most outstanding Halloween costume. You didn't get any accolades and you had to build that inner sense of self on your own. That's where the anxiety that you're talking about comes into play is, am I meeting a standard and who is setting that standard?
And that's what you said about your patient. You said the reason I felt a little bit okay about her was the fact that she had come in my office and she had pulled herself up before. And knowing that she had pulled herself up before gave me a little bit of hope. It's the same idea. So go ahead and take all the struggle and failure and difficulty out of your kid's life, or drop the bar of society so that everyone's a winner, everyone's a hard worker, everyone's this and that. Objectively, they're not. And when they find that out, because the real world will show you what you are or what you are not. And other people that aren't your family members, aren't your friends, they don't owe you these illusions. Your father might have told you you're the greatest thing since sliced bread every day of your life. Your boss might look at you and say, you suck. You're a liar. You're not honest. You're not consistent. And if you believed the other story, your world will come crashing down because you have not existed in a basic truth of the world, right? So you sparked something in my brain where, and we gotta wrap this up soon. I just want to let you know, we've talked for over 2 hours and this dialogue has been, incredible. One of the things I tell all my fighters, because fighting is a difficult road to walk down, man. You're like, you want to try to make it to the UFC, like we're following pipe dreams. And most people would look at what we're doing, like when you were speaking about the outliers, like, hey, that's probably not you. I actually deal in the opposite. I have the belief that regardless of start, besides debilitating mental or physical effect, some of the people that have broken through and have made it, that are making huge paydays and fighting on television, are people that the vast majority would have said, no way, it's not possible, go a different route. And it's funny because we're willing to give that type of guidance when it's, well, you know what I mean? Like you're going to tell every kid you're a winner and you got all this, but as soon as they're an adult and they're trying to go to the world, if I said, I want to be a professional fighter, I want to do this, you'd say, oh, that's highly unlikely. Well, then why did you tell me the whole time when I was growing up that I'm this, that, or the other thing?
Yeah.
I tell the fighters all the time, you have to have a warrior mentality for life. And you had just referenced that a minute ago. You have to have that warrior mentality, but not in the ring, not on the mats, in every endeavor that you do. And what you need to change is warriors are not the ones that always win. They're the ones that always fight. And if you can embrace, I call it growth mentality here. If you can embrace growth mentality, it is not this moment that matters at all. In this match that I'm about to have on the mats with my teammate and my friend in preparation for the real world challenge, it is irrelevant whether I win or lose. It does not matter. What matters is, do I go through the struggle that over a consistent period will yield the success later on? And if I can learn to have that type of mindset, I don't need to be the one that always wins. I need to be the one that always fights.
Yeah.
And tries. That is the secret, man. If you can learn to adopt that principle, you will go as far as you can in whatever ventures matter to you. And the ones that don't, I don't care about being a valedictorian because school wasn't for me. I am fascinated by learning. I read. I'm reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius right now. I love to read, but I have to seek out information on my own. So when I see the valedictorian, I can celebrate her win without feeling bad about me,
right,
and knowing that I don't need that level of success. And then I can evaluate someone that's better than me, maybe as a fighter, when I'm coming up and say, I'm inspired by that because I do want that. They're better than me. They do this, they do that. I want to grow to that. And it helps pull me up the ladder versus just saying, well, I'm just as good as you. Because objectively, I'm not.
So one of the things that you just brought to mind, and I think this will help wrap up some of what we've been talking about, is I mentioned this idea of realism and having this objective evaluation of who you are. So in the example we've been talking about, if you've got parents and teachers and school systems that have been saying how good somebody is, you need to be objective, meaning you need to hear several different voices. So you need that coach's voice or you need that teammate's voice that says, you're not as good as you think you are. But I want to flip that on its head for a second and think about what we've been talking about in terms of psychological disorders and mental illness. We talked a lot about distorted thought. So if you can imagine a situation where somebody was in an abusive household with abusive parents who told them how bad they were all the time, if they didn't have another voice, grandparent, teacher, pastor, saying, no, John, you're a good person. Your parents are saying this, but I want to show you evidence of how good you are the way I see it. So those voices that predominate play such an important role in your development, whether they're predominantly positive, so they're not setting you up to deal with failures, or they're predominantly negative, so you're not seeing the positives. So in both instances, you need to have several voices giving you different perspectives. Because if you only listen to one, whether it's your own internal voice or that of your abusive father, that's the one that's going to predominate. So you need that voice that's saying, no, you're not bad all the time, or no, you're not the best, but I see potential in you.
Incredible. 100%. And the grounding mechanism should be as closely correlated to the reality as possible. Because, like, let's say you had people telling you all the time that you're a bad person. What if you are objectively a bad person? What if you do lie, cheat, steal, harm people, do these things? Do you get to just
multiple voices should tell you that.
Yeah. And like some people, though, they'll live in the delusion of like, no, I am a good person. If you that might be the delusion. You need to identify, were these people the ones that were not accurate? And the coach that sees greatness with me, or the grandfather, this is more reality. I am a good person. I do love people. I do want to contribute to the world. Then you can determine that that was not accurate. But if multiple people are telling you that you are terrible at this A, B, C, or D, and you refuse to accept that truth because it probably sucks to accept something like that, both can misalign you. So the final thing that I want to ask about on the podcast, and I don't even want to go in. I had a tangent pop up into my brain, but I'm not going to go down that road. But basically, like, we're living in a culture now where, like, even men and women are being pushed into the same buckets. Like, men should be able to compete against women and women against men because we're all equal. And if you disagree with that statement, then you're, this, that, or the other thing. And it's like, no, we're not. We've never been since the dawn of time. You and I did not grow up in a world where men and women are the same physically. Overall, are there women that are stronger than men? Yes. But by the vast majority, are men more physically dominant than women? Yes. Objectively. A lot of people can't say that nowadays. And it's back to these delusions that are going to make things very difficult. So not to go off on that tangent unless you want to speak on that, but I'm trying to actively fight as many delusions as possible. And I do this in my own life. It's funny, a lot of what you just said is actually quoted in a lot of Marcus Aurelius's work about, like, do not listen too much to the naysayers, but don't listen to the praise of the good people either. What he was trying to do is, don't get on my high horse about all these people telling me that I'm a deity among men and I'm all these things and I'm that, but also don't listen to my biggest critics. What I need to do is ground myself in what I am as closely as possible. The final thing I want to ask about, and this episode, man, I've enjoyed this conversation so much. I hope to maybe be able to have lunch with you one day and speak more off the podcast because I'm fascinated by your work, and I'm fascinated by, like, I love the study of this, and like I'm going to watch this episode 10 times and try to learn what I can from you. How is your mental health knowing a subject like this so deeply? Because a lot of the times there's like a blessing and a curse that comes with, for a man that understands the human psyche so deeply, when you encounter the internal demons, the difficulties, relationship stresses, whatever it is, are you able to just snap right back? Are you, because you understand it in a textbook sense and a clinical sense, are you someone that dominates your mental health?
I mean, I think because of what we talked about earlier, where my career choices have been based on life experience. So, it's not an accident that I'm studying brain and behavior and mental health because of where I came from and the experiences I dealt with. But having now spent, 2 decades watching and observing and talking with other people, and then learning the theory and the treatment hierarchies and all the things that we look at, I'm much better able to have a grounded perspective with myself. And I'll give you an example. We can close with this if you want to. So I decided to come to Wayne State from Atlanta after 15 years. And it was in large part to build this new trauma center that I've been talking about. So it was more of an entrepreneurial move. It was more of a choice. I didn't have to find another job. I could have stayed in Atlanta and done the same thing I was doing and been successful. But it was the idea of stepping out and trying something new. And of course, moving a family and all the distress that comes with a move and having young kids and a spouse that's also working, all that stress. So it all compounds on itself. So I had a situation where like I said, I went to the Air Force Academy for a year, and during that year away, there were things going on at Wayne State, and relationships that I thought were stable and effective weren't as stable as I thought they were, and so I seriously considered leaving and trying something new, and I've recruited to other places. And had I not had the experiences that I've had in my life, but also the training that I've had, I was able to step back and say, you know what, what's best for my family right now is stability. And rather than uproot my family again because of a situation that happened at work, and rather than fix the me problem, I need to look at the bigger perspective. Was it worth trying to address some harms that were done to me? Was it worth trying to exact some kind of revenge or what have you to completely blow up what I've been building here just so I feel better about myself? And
What's the answer to
what
that
I
question?
came to in the last few weeks was, at this stage in my life, having done this for as long as I've been doing this and having the experiences and the family situation I have, what I want is not important right now. My sense of accolades, my sense of not feeling, the ego bruise of some of the stuff that I dealt with professionally, that's just work, man. So looking at life holistically, I don't need to seek out that temporary feeling of, I got you. You came for me, I got you. I'm thinking about my kids and their development, and maybe it's not the best situation for me professionally, but it's the best for me holistically.
That's awesome, man. And you know what's crazy about that statement that you started with? You said, I found grounded perspective. And if there's one thing that we should wish upon all people that are going through hell or difficulty or trauma in their life, is to be able to get to a point where they can say they have grounded perspective.